Hyun Sa-lee said, "I was 7 years old when I saw my first public execution." We thought this was a very normal thing to do. Constant public executions were a constant reminder that I shouldn't do anything to disobey our government and the leaders. Walking home from middle school, Lee would witness starvation and death in her streets, resulting from the famine crisis that her government had ignored. But she was careful never to criticize her leader. If she did, her family could be taken away in the middle of the night to a prison camp. And besides, she'd been taught to love him in school. Kim Jong-il was her hero. This was life for millions living under North Korea's oppressive Kim regime. Unfortunately, living in a country that restricts freedom is by no means an isolated experience. While we'd like to think that democracy has strengthened since the wall came down in Berlin, according to the Freedom House Global Report, 2021 was actually the 16th consecutive year of global decline in freedom, with only 20% of the current population living in a free country. You may find this shocking, and that's likely because modern-day dictators are more subtle in their pursuit of power. Instead of taking over through military coups, most get themselves elected, then little by little dismantle democratic protections from within. Take Viktor Orban, for example. He got himself elected as the Hungarian Prime Minister on a platform of protecting Hungarians. But once in power, it became clear that he was more interested in protecting himself. He took over the media, rewrote the Constitution, filled the courts with his allies, and silenced anyone who opposed him. Like Hungary, the governments of Venezuela, Turkey, and Poland have also taken similar paths, with their stable democracies quietly eroding into oppressive regimes. This global trend towards tyranny threatens freedom for us all. No country is immune. In fact, the United States was just listed as a backsliding democracy for the first time ever in 2021. Given the recent turbulence in our country, I think this is something that we really need to address. So, how did these leaders manage to get themselves elected in the first place? And why is it that we can't see them coming? The answer is psychology. Whether consciously or unconsciously, these leaders are able to manipulate our psychology. To give you a better idea of what I'm talking about, I'm going to highlight the warning signs of a rising authoritarian regime from a psychological perspective. As you listen, I hope that you'll be assessing the state of your own democracy. So let's start by looking at the behaviors that we can find in a political leader. Generally, authoritarian leaders will use fear and confusion to emotionally destabilize their populations so that they can gain control. How do you know if your leader is attempting to do this? Well, here are a few indications. First, they find or create a threat to the nation and blow it out of proportion in order to undermine their population's sense of security. When we feel like we lack stability, our natural instinct is to seek out strong leaders who can bring us safety and order. This provides the perfect opportunity for a dictator to step in as the savior, leaving their citizens feeling both dependent on and indebted to them. In addition, studies show that when people are in vulnerable states, they're more easily influenced. So, let's look at an example. Here we have our very well-known friend, Vladimir Putin. And when Putin was first running for president, he was a relatively unknown prime minister, coming from an administration with an approval rating of only 2%. Then, a series of bombs exploded in apartments across Russia, killing hundreds. And Putin used this event in order to boost his popularity. He blamed and invaded Chechnya, which won him both Russian admiration and ultimately the presidency. Putin strategically exploited this event for his own purposes, and some even believe that he had planted the bombs himself. So, in addition, authoritarian leaders will often find an enemy to blame, and this can often be minority groups. This makes the threat that they've been warning of seem more concrete in the eyes of their people, and it absolves their citizens of feeling responsibility for this problem. In addition, it capitalizes on our natural tendency to form in-groups and out-groups, unifying a large portion of the population underneath the leader. An example of this is Hugo Chavez, as we see on the slide, and he was an authoritarian leader in Venezuela. He decided to target the wealthy elite, but we have other examples, of course, like Hitler, who targeted the Jewish people. Putin, as we saw on our last slide, targeted the Chechens, and the Kim family of North Korea warns their people against what they call US Yankee devils. That's us. Okay, so another way in which authoritarian leaders spread fear and confusion is by calling respected leaders, experts, and the media into question. This erodes their population's trust in outside support systems, leading them to feel more isolated, insecure, and even paranoid. An example of this is Viktor Orban. He launched a campaign against one of the last independent media news outlets in his country, and the government has been claiming that one of the leaders in this organization has committed tax fraud and should be jailed. In addition, Putin has instituted a law that allows him to jail anyone who reports what he deems fake news. Lastly, authoritarian leaders will use a variety of techniques in order to reinforce, establish, and program messages into the minds of their people. This can include lying and manufacturing facts to support their claims, spreading conspiracy theories, using inflammatory or loaded language such as criminal immigrants or corrupt media in order to program messages into their people's brains. And it could also be using propaganda, very subjective propaganda, from every outlet available in their country. So, through these somewhat extreme techniques, authoritarian leaders are able to take advantage of a vulnerable population that feels isolated, paranoid, and often confused. To get a better idea of whether a leader in your country is using some of these tactics, ask yourself these questions. 1. Does a leader find a threat, blame an enemy, and step in as the savior? 2. Do they attack the media or other independent support systems that are in the country? And 3, do they spread messages through inflammatory language or propaganda that can be oftentimes very harmful? If the answer is yes, it's probably time that you take a deeper look into what's going on in your government. Okay, so now let's take a look at the behavior that we can find in the population that's being governed. The public's response to a current leader can be a great indicator of whether tyranny is a risk in a given country. Often in populations that are being influenced by authoritarians, you'll find growing nationalist sentiments. This can be indicated in multiple ways. One of them could be proliferation of nationalist symbols, rallies. A couple others are hateful messages against others, or violence against the designated enemy. So for example, in Hungary today shows that 57% of Hungarians have shown a distaste against immigrants in their country. This is likely due to the anti-immigrant sentiments that we hear from Viktor Orban, such as he said that every single migrant poses a public security and terror risk. In these populations, you'll also find blind acceptance, blind faith, and obedience. The key here is that the obedient population is willing to take whatever their leader says as fact, no matter how unlikely, unscientific, or irrational it may be. For example, polls show that most Russians actually support the war in Ukraine. And this is a source that's from the New York Times, by the way. So according to these polls, most Russians actually do support the war, even though they've been given some of the weakest reasons for doing so. Let me tell you a list of some of these reasons. So first, Russia has said that they invaded in order to stop drug-addled neo-Nazis, genocide, American biological weapons factories, my personal favorite, which is birds and reptiles that are trained to carry pathogens into Russia, and also the Ukrainian government, which is bombing its own cities, including theaters that are sheltering children. In addition to the warning signs that we can find between the population and the leader that's being governed, there are also general warning signs that would indicate a population is susceptible to authoritarian influence. One of the biggest of these is low morale. When people feel a sense of low self-esteem, they'll often look for a new source of pride, purpose, and sometimes an entirely new life. Often in depressed circumstances, they're incredibly susceptible to strong leaders who will step in and promise a better future. A prime example of this is post-World War I Germany. The Germans had been beaten down both psychologically and financially from their loss in the war, and because of this, they were drawn to Hitler's promise of making Germany great again. Interestingly enough, we've also seen a recent sentiment from the leader of Turkey, Erdogan, who has promised to make Turkey great again. And I know that we've heard this slogan elsewhere as well. Okay, anyway, lastly, it's important to look out for serious political polarization. In a healthy democracy, multiple perspectives work together to govern a country. But when opposing parties become so hyper-polarized that they can no longer agree, democracy breaks down. So the example for this is actually the United States. Currently, our two political parties are moving further and further towards extremes, and this is creating a serious block in political progress. This is one of the main reasons why political experts believe that our democracy is at risk. So, if you'd like to get a better idea of whether your population is showing these risk signs, you can ask yourself these questions. Are they showing signs of growing nationalist sentiment, such as violence against an enemy or hateful messages against others? Do these populations show low morale or conditions that could lead to low morale? And lastly, is there serious political polarization, from your perspective at least, in your country? So our everyday lives are so busy that sometimes it can feel impossible to stay on top of these subtle indicators. But from the story of Hyunsa Lee and many others in Turkey, Poland, Venezuela, and elsewhere, we can see the devastating consequences of allowing one leader to have too much power. Here are a couple of little steps that you can all take in order to support your democratic freedoms. The first one is pretty obviously vote. Stay engaged even when your system seems unfair or polarized. The second one is keep tabs on your leadership. Make sure you're up to date on the policies and programs and initiatives of your leaders, and also make sure that you fact check so that you're not practicing blind faith. The next one is to stay in tune with your own feelings. The subconscious can pick up on things that are dangerous to you without the conscious even knowing. And because of this, if you feel a sense of fear when practicing basic human rights, like openly practicing your religion or speaking out on public issues, this can indicate that there's something wrong in your country. Next, it's important to speak up when you see something concerning. Another way in which you can contribute is by joining organizations that support your democratic freedoms. And lastly, make sure to post, protest, contact your representatives, and make your voice heard. The fate of any democracy is in the hands of its people, and by exercising our rights, we can direct that fate. Thank you.